This video is looking at intersectional issues of disability, gender and law, and covering some statistical information that you may find interesting. Many people with disabilities perceive the justice system and our system of laws in Australia as being inherently ableist, and this is common across a range of disability critiques. And please notice that in this video and others, I use the terminology often disabled people based on the social model of disability. That is that while a person may have a particular physical condition such as pain or limited mobility, it is society's structuring which creates many of the disabilities they face. For example, primarily relying upon stairs or non-accessible areas where people with mobility challenges cannot enter, or primarily relying upon written script rather than accessible forms of braille or things that can be read easily by a screen reader, or audist, relying on audible information rather than ensuring that most things are presented as both audible and visual, for example, subtitles on movies, etc. Women with disabilities in this are what I'm going to focus on, and statistics in this video. 20% of Australian women, that is 1 in 5, identify as having a disability. I'm one of them. I have a hearing impairment, as well as some other health conditions which affect my disability status. The definition of disability used in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is that those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual or sensory impairments which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others have disabilities. The UN Convention has been implemented in Australia under the Disability Discrimination Act and its disability standards and guidelines which are promulgated under that Act. We also have a Disability Services Act and the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the NDIS, both of which relate to providing assistance for people with disabilities, and at the Queensland level we have various legislation including the Anti-Discrimination Act 1991. Some of the issues that arise for people with disabilities is they are more likely to need to access health, human and welfare services because many people with disabilities have ongoing health issues, not all. A person with a hearing disability, for example, may not consider that to be a health issue, but rather a cultural issue, particularly if they are capital D deaf. And to accessing other human services and welfare services. People with disabilities are more likely to interact with police than people without disabilities. This comes in part from the fact that people who have mental illnesses are very overpoliced and likely to have issues around interactions with police, many of which result in problems around criminality or of being victims of criminality. The people with disabilities are disproportionately likely to be victims of crime. Women with disabilities in particular have extraordinarily high levels of sexual assault against them. Women with disabilities are less likely to be employed than abled women, that is women without disabilities. They're 9% less likely to be employed. That is compared to 21% less likely to be employed for disabled men versus abled men. People with disabilities are less likely to have access to higher education, and however, women with disabilities are more likely to complete Year 10 than men with disabilities. People with disabilities may have are more likely to have lower standards of living due to underemployment or unemployment, and they are also more likely to have higher costs of living due to the costs of accessing health, assistive and other services which are made necessary by their disabilities. People with disabilities are overrepresented in criminal justice, particularly, unfortunately, people with intellectual disabilities and mental illness disabilities. Approximately 11 to 15% of people involved in the criminal justice system have intellectual disabilities. More than 40% of people involved in the criminal justice system reported severe symptoms consistent with clinical disorders when asked a range of questions. They were not necessarily people who were actually diagnosed as having various disorders, but they reported symptomology of various disorders, including some conduct disorders and substance abuse disorders, which were the most common. Though, as you saw from our statistics on women and incarceration, very high numbers of women who are incarcerated have been hospitalised for mental illness issues. At the Queensland level, the 12-month prevalence of mental disorders for Indigenous women in Queensland prisons is 86%. Which is higher than the prevalence for Indigenous men and non-Indigenous women. So being Indigenous, having a disability and being a woman all combine together to create higher levels of a history, of 12-month history of mental disorder for those women once they're in prison. The types of psychiatric disorders experienced by Indigenous women in prison included things such as substance misuse disorders, anxiety disorders, which are 51%, depressive disorders, 29%, and psychotic disorders, 23%. Why are people who have disabilities, and particular types of disabilities, including mental illness and intellectual disability, more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system? Well, one, they are more likely to be targeted by others and become victims. But being involved as a person who's been charged with a crime, there are three main hypotheses that researchers put forward. One is the susceptibility hypothesis that postulates that people with intellectual disabilities in particular are more likely to engage in criminal behaviour because of their impairment. The second hypothesis is the differential treatment hypothesis, which postulates that people with intellectual disabilities are actually not more likely to commit crimes than people generally. However, they are more likely to be convicted of crimes because courts and court processes may be particularly challenging and difficult for them, and they may find it particularly difficult to mount an effective defence. And the final, the psychological and socio-economic disadvantage hypothesis postulates that people with intellectual disability are more likely than other people to wind up involved in the criminal justice system because of environmental factors, where they are more likely to become involved in or be suspected of committing crimes. For example, because they may be more likely to shoplift because they haven't got the funds to buy something. Or another part of this is that they may be taken advantage of by people who see them as someone who would be easy to involve in a crime and easy to actually blame for a crime. So while keeping their own hands clean, but while the other person profits. So there are a range of different reasons why people with certain types of disabilities are actually more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system.